Welcome back to the Seth Leibsohn Show. I am Seth Leibsohn. Our phone number 602-508-0960. If great friendships are born from great tragedies, one of my great friendships was born with our next guest, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, a man from whom I've learned as much as I have learned from anyone. He is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, author of an extremely important book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, and American Muslim Patriots Fight to Save His Faith. Listeners to this show know him not only as a regular guest, but as a guest host. And this Thursday, he will be with Bill Montgomery and Sebastian Gorka at our event, Ultimate Decisions, at the Scottsdale Civic Center, 960thepatriot.com to get your tickets. Dr. Jasser, thanks for coming back on, and I'm looking forward to seeing you Thursday.
Oh, so am I. It's going to be a great evening, and good to be with you on this day. There's no one else I'd rather be talking to today.
Oh, my gosh. That's nice of you to say. That's nice of you to say, kind of you to say. I feel the same way of you. Doctor, days like today, we have to go back to basics, I think. We get a lot wrong. But walk us through, if you will, why you founded the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, what you were doing and what you thought on 9/11, and where we've gone since.
Well, I think, everybody in America had their life change after 9/11 in some way. There are those who gave the ultimate sacrifice, that the thousands that died, and then so many more that were affected either physically or mentally. And our country then entered wars. And I have to tell you, in the ashes of 9/11, I saw my life shift, and I realized that, the Muslim world, the Islamic religion, had a deep problem that only Muslims could fix. And while it wasn't the central part of the faith that I knew growing up in the laboratory of Wisconsin, where I separated political Islam from the religion I learned and was blessed to have from my parents that escaped Syria, but realized there was a dominant establishment in the religion that had sprouted a tip of the iceberg, which was Al-Qaeda. And our organization, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, was founded in separation of mosque and state. And I have to tell you, in 2003, when we launched, and then we had our rally in Patriot Square against terrorism and against Islamism, people said, why don't you just focus on terrorism? Why are you separating mosque and state?
Yeah.
It took until 2013 when ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, grew, that people said, oh, now I understand what you did 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And 17 years later, people are so obsessed about what's happening in Washington, they still are not understanding that salvo, which was the greatest attack on our homeland since World War II, was still the only first one in a global conflict that is going to be generational against theocracy in most of the Muslim countries.
Doctor, as much as you have spoken, as many videos of you there are, and as much as you have written, there still seems to be confusion over an issue that maybe those who aren't as familiar with your work as they should be have. And I wonder if you might straighten them out a little bit. The difference between what your project is, reform, and what people say, moderate Islam. I wonder if you might draw that distinction for us.
Yeah, I think, as you know, I don't use the term moderate Islam because, tyrants in the world like Erdogan of Turkey says there is no moderate Islam, there's one Islam, and it's his Islam, and journalists and citizens are ending up tortured and in jail, victims of his Islam. So the nuance of, when you talk to folks, regular Americans will say, well, moderate Islam are the ones that don't want to kill us, the ones that are peaceful, etc. But what is that? I think ultimately reform-minded Muslims, and, it also depends on which type of reform. The head of Saudi Arabia now, the Crown Prince, calls himself a reformer, and as you know, I've been very skeptical of his reform, and I have to say, don't mean to say I told you so, but you look in the last few months, it's turned out to be a lot of fake reforms going on in Saudi Arabia. So real reform is Western values. I have a video I put out on Facebook and Twitter today, and I said, it's time for us to take offense after 9/11. 17 years, what is offense? Offense is not just playing whack-a-mole against the terrorists and against political Islamic states. Offense is advancing Western values. So real reformers are those who believe in free speech. Real reformers are those who believe in equality, freedom to leave and come back and forth from Islam, to not follow any religion, to be an atheist, to have complete freedom of idea, and realize that Islam is an idea. It doesn't have rights. There is no such a term as Islamophobia. So I think that's what reformers really are, those who are trying to bring our Muslim ideology into the 21st century.
Perfectly stated. I wonder if I can have you for one more segment. This was a brief
Sure.
one. You know, you've been in this chair several times. And talk a little bit about what we got right and what we've gotten wrong and still need to do over the last 17 years. Yes?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
We will be right back with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Welcome back to the Seth Leibsohn Show. We had a lot of good conversation yesterday about heroes. One of the ways to identify a hero is to be able to look at a person and tell your children, follow that man. Do what he does. I've said that about Dr. Jasser, Zuhdi Jasser, for many, many years. I say it again today and will till my dying breath. He is a hero to me. Dr. Jasser, before we go to the question, I wanted to ask you about what we've gotten right and wrong since over the last 17 years. I wanted to ask you about a quote I don't think in all our years of knowing each other I've ever asked you about. And it's a quote from former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. And it's something he wrote in his autobiography about the mindset of modern Islam. Can I read it to you and just get your take?
Sure.
He writes, "In the mindset that is modern Islam, there is one spectrum, not several. At the furthest end of the spectrum are the extremists who advocate terrorism to further their goal of an Islamic state. It is true they are few in number, but their sympathizers reach far further along the spectrum than we think. While many do not agree with terrorism, they understand why it is happening. Further along the spectrum are those who condemn terrorists, but in a curious and dangerous way buy into bits of their worldview. And then there is a group that reaches even further into the middle of the spectrum, but they have not yet confidently found their way to articulating a thoroughly reformed view of Islam. In other words, it is true they find terrorism repugnant and they wish to be in an alliance with the Western nations against it, but they have not yet found a translation into an alternative narrative for Islam that makes sense of its history and provides a coherent vision for its future." This is why you exist, yes?
Amen. I have to tell you that, to sort of whittle that down to 2018 era issues, I think the bottom line is, in the Trump era, we're talking about establishment, right? The establishment sort of doesn't want to look at change. The establishment in the Muslim community is the cancer. The establishment in the Muslim community is the one that tries to figure out how to put a modern faith on a 13th century interpretation and refuses to look at anything new, and thinks that the use of modern technology somehow will modernize thought, when in fact we need to go through an enlightenment. We need to go through a separation of mosque and state, a real infusion of liberty into the practice of Islam and the interpretation of the Quran. So he's right. You look, many of the identity left will say that, oh, you're anti-Muslim if you say most of the mosques in America are backwards. And listen, only 15% of Muslims go to mosque. You're not anti-Muslim. You're anti-establishment. So the establishment in the Muslim community is a major problem. They refuse to acknowledge that their interpretation of Quran and the Hadith and most of the scripture is draconian and empowers Islamic republics from Iran to Pakistan to Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. And the only way to change this is, obviously Muslims need to start to wake up. And I'll tell you, as much as the left and others have been a major obstacle to my work, the biggest obstacle has been the anesthesia of Muslims. They are completely anesthetized, most of them, or they'll pat me on the back and say, we love what we're doing, but we're in America. That's why we're here. We don't want to take this on. We left those countries. And as our family in Idlib now is looking at possibly more chemical weapons attacks, and the Khomeinis are destroying Syria and others, at some point, good men and women need to wake up and begin to realize that what's happening over there is going to end up back here again like it did in 9/11.
That's a great segue to the big question I wanted to ask you. Lessons we've gotten right, lessons we've gotten wrong. You have seen it from your perch at American Islamic Forum for Democracy through your other work. I want to point out you've also been a member appointed, a confirmed member of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. So on that, taking off from what you last said, what have we yet to learn as a country, not necessarily within the Muslim community, but as a country, and what have we done right, what have we not gotten right yet?
Well, I mean, you look at Joe Scarborough today tweeting out his article that said that the biggest threat, more than any foreign enemy, is the Trump administration. You wonder what we haven't gotten right?
Yeah.
You have an entire political movement in America that still doesn't understand that the Islamic world, which is a quarter of the world's population, is convulsing in a battle between a secular nationalist fascism versus theocracy.
Mm-hmm.
And both sides hate us. Mm-hmm. Assad hates us and ISIS hates us in Syria. Mm-hmm. Saudi Arabia, the monarchs might like us, but their form of government doesn't share our values. So either we come together as a country and realize, and I think the Trump administration did it right, they completely tanked the old CVE program, which was countering violent extremism, because it meant nothing.
Right.
And still you have pundits saying, oh, look at the white supremacist terrorists are just as much of a problem. And I saw local TV yesterday, Channel 12 and 15, talking about 9/11, and you saw experts from ASU saying, well, terrorism is, the face of terror has changed from 9/11. Now it includes, the shooter in Las Vegas and others, and not just radical Islamic terrorists.
Right.
Are you kidding me?
These are not global
You've got
threats.
Countries that are falling apart across the planet because of radical Islam.
That's right.
It's very different.
That's very different. I saw one statistic that said radical Islam is responsible for the death of 600 people in just the last month across the world. Give or take by 10%, and you get an understanding of what Joe Scarborough and his friends don't understand.
It's completely, and this is the issue, is I hope now the next step is, what are we doing in offense? It's not CVE, it should be CI, countering Islamism. And that if you love Muslims, a tough love doesn't mean that you're afraid to demonize anybody, but actually separating out the fact that there's reformers from theocrats is a way to show that you don't generalize. Because actually, by dismissing the problem, you're saying, we don't want to offend the 1.5 billion people, so therefore we'll conclude that they all might be prone to radicalism, so we're going to keep our mouths shut, which is actually more bigoted than dealing with the reality.
Exactly right, and well said and well put. We have a minute left. I know it's hard to do in a minute, but you mentioned Syria. You mentioned two sides that are not our friends. What our posture towards Syria should be right now, sir?
Well, as much as I wish we had been more aggressive 6-7 years ago, now our posture should be to make sure, as we did in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that there are no crimes against humanity happening. I think get the UN involved, have a UN protection force, if possible, not to be led by the U.S., but led by the free world in the West. I don't think these catastrophes are going to go away. And ultimately, the only solution in Syria is going to happen when Iran falls. Iran is on the verge of falling. When that government falls, they have a revolution. The Khomeinis go away. Syria will also eventually fall. But short of that, I think it's simply band-aids of a major crimes against humanity in Syria.
As you and I have pointed out, others as well, we had Andy McCarthy, it's easy to forget but important to remember, Syria is the tip of the sword of Iran. No Iran, no Syria, no Assad regime.
Exactly. And that's the way we need to look at it. The suit and tie ophthalmologist behind him is the most theocratically radical regime on the planet. He may pretend to be secular, but he's run by the most radical Islamist government on the planet. And
shame on global fancy magazines that have promoted he and his family as avant-garde. Dr. Jasser, thank you very, very much, and we look forward to seeing you Thursday night.
Thank you. Can't wait. Take care.
You bet. I'm Seth Leibsohn. Our phone number, anything you want, but particularly interested in your memories of what you were doing this day 17 years ago and what you learned and what you thought. 602-508-0960. We'll be right back.